Hi, everyone, and welcome to our session, the FHIR RESTful API. We are so glad you're taking time to join us today. And before we kick things off, well, we still have a few other people joining the session. We're going to cover a few quick announcements. So first of all, if you do happen to have any technical difficulties during the session, please log out of the Whova app and then sign back in. We think that will take care of it. If you still happen to have any issues after that, please contact the DevDays support team on Zulip. To post any questions during the presentation, please use that Q&A box, as we do have moderators answering the questions during the session. And then we will also have questions that will be available to view after the session has ended. Regarding your video and microphone, please do not attempt to enable them unless you are prompted by the presenter or the moderator. We've muted everyone by default, so if you can't hear or see something during the presentation, use the chat box to let us know. We do value all of your feedback on your DevDays experience and on this session, so please take a minute to complete the survey located in the Whova app after you have completed this session. And then lastly, don't forget to check out the DevDays swag we have made available. There is a special online store. It's hl7.me/merch. So we have some specific DevDays and FHIR swag you might find interesting, so check it out. This session will be recorded, so I wanted to go ahead and introduce our speaker and moderator. Abel Enthoven of FHIR will be presenting to us this afternoon. He is a FHIR enthusiast. He designs and develops on Bonk and Forge. He is a former healthcare professional, so he's seen it all firsthand. He likes to focus on usability and the reduction of clicks, unless when he runs or rides his bike. And then our moderator this afternoon is Diego Kamenker, who many of you know, and he is with HL7 Argentina. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Abel.
Yeah, thank you very much, Beth. I'm just going to share my screen now. Yeah. I want to tell you guys a little bit about the FHIR RESTful API. Beth already introduced me. Thank you for that, Beth. And also thank you, Diego, for wanting to be my wingman. That's very nice of you. I'm Abel Enthoven, indeed, and I work for FHIR. We don't just organize DevDays. We also do some work to build a server, for example, a Devon server, and we have a website, simplifier.net, where you can manage your resources and all your FHIR stuff. I want to tell you something about the RESTful API, and it's René Spronk asked me about it. René Spronk is my colleague. He asked me to do this. And when he did, I kind of thought back about the first time that I used the RESTful API. And it wasn't very, it didn't go very well. I had a few troubles. And I looked up the documentation, and the documentation for FHIR is really great. So if you have questions after this session, of course, feel free to ask, but you can also look at the documentation, because it's super great, and it will help you further. Yeah, about this presentation, I want to tell you something about the FHIR REST API. And the REST API, of course, is a way to communicate with a FHIR server. This was the picture I was looking for. And a FHIR server is actually a storage, of course, of FHIR resources. So the FHIR resources are stored inside a database. And I just wanted to make the distinction between a state-based server, as a FHIR server is, and an event-based world. The event-based world was the world of HL7 version 2. And also, there's also a solution in FHIR actually for events, and that's FHIR messaging. And with FHIR Patch, you can do some of the actions that you would like to do to apply changes to your resources. So as you see on the left side, you see that a message is transferred into a delta, and the delta is applied to a resource, and then the resource is saved into a database. That's the message-based world. The state-based world, you directly save and load your resources. And now I'm going to the contents of my presentation. So if you're talking about saving and loading resources, then of course you're talking about CRUD. That's one of the big parts of this presentation. So creation, updating, and deletion of resources. And of course, when you're doing that, you have a validation. You're going to have transactions, so you're going to want to do something in a transactional way. And you have concurrency that you have to deal with. And of course, this whole block, that's one of the big parts of the presentation. Then you have the other big block, retrieve block. That's going to be about searching resources. So you're going to retrieve resources from the database. And I'm also going to talk about versioning and about paging. I'm just going to briefly touch patch and security because, well, I'm going to tell you later why I'm just going to touch it briefly. So to create a resource is probably one of the first things that you want to do. To create a resource, you use the method post, as you would normally do in a REST world. And the resource ID is then assigned by the server. And the ID you get back is in the location header. So I'm just gonna make a call to the server because I'm running a Vonk server locally. And I'm going to make this call to the server. So I'm going to do a post on the server on the resource patient. So I'm going to post a new patient. This content type is also important. You want to let the server know what you're going to send. And what I'm going to send is this patient. It's Justin Timberlake, Mr. Justin Timberlake. So I'm just going to send this to the server. And it replied with a 201 created. As you can see, it replies with the patient itself. So it gives me back my patient, my created patient. It has assigned an ID, as you can see. I've sent it an ID, ID 1, but it chose to give me a new ID, this GUID that you can see here. And that's because I used a post. In other actions, you will see that it's different. The other interesting thing about this is down below, here in Meta. You can see that it has assigned a version ID. So this server does versioning. I will tell you about that later. And it gives me a time when it was last updated. Another interesting thing is here, up here. So it sent me back this, the content type. It sent me back JSON, like I posted, but it also added this part, FHIR version 4.4.0. And it tells me something about the FHIR server itself, because the FHIR server itself is running on an R4, so FHIR version 4. You can see it here on the endpoint as well. So the other very interesting thing is the location. And that was something that I did wrong in my first encounter with a FHIR host. I thought that you would have to read the ID from here. And you could do that in this case, but the FHIR server doesn't always return the resource. Sometimes it returns nothing as a content. So it's to always have an idea of what the ID is. You can always use this field, location. It's the header field, and it contains the ID of the patient. That's here. And after that, you see a reference to history. So this is what you can see here is the version of the patient. So it's actually the first version. And I will tell you about history later, but the most important thing to remember now is that you get the ID back here. So now I'm going to create an observation. Actually, to do that, I have to go back because I want to create this observation for the patient. So I'm going to go back, do this again, and copy the ID that I have here. So I've got 2 patients actually now in the database for Mr. Justin Timberlake. There are 2 now. So I'm going to use that ID. I'm going to paste it here. So now I have a reference to the patient that I just created. So I'm creating an observation for that patient now. Let's run this. Okay, so what you see now is that I've created the observation for the patient with a reference. And as you can see, the reference is not just the ID anymore. The server added this part, the first part. And it's, of course, the server itself, so the endpoint up until R4, and then the patient as well. So it knows that it's a reference to a patient. Let me see if there's anything else. No. Continue. So that was a create. Now I'm going to talk to you about an upsert. It's a little bit of a weird thing to say, an upsert. It's, of course, an update and an insert. And that's because the put action in FHIR is defined in 2 ways. So you can use a put to either create a patient or to update a patient. So if the resource exists, if the patient exists, it's completely replaced. And you get a 200 OK response from the server. If it does not exist, it is created using your own ID. And that's interesting because if you want to use your own ID for a resource, you have to use put. As you saw before in the create action, it assigns an ID and the server assigns, in this case, it's bonk, it assigns GUIDs. But if you want to have a meaningful ID that you want to use for yourself, then you could also use put. And in the case that it does create a resource, it will also return 201 created instead of 200 OK. The creation of a resource through put it's a special server capability. So not every server will do that, but we will talk about capabilities later. So this is an example of a put. I have Mrs. Aretha Franklin here, and I'm going to put her in the database on ID 1. Okay, she is in the database. You see that the ID is indeed 1. It did not assign its own ID. So we kept our own ID. And yeah, I'm just going to go on and try and change something for Mrs. Aretha Franklin, because I know actually that she's called Aretha Louise Franklin. So I'm going to add Louise here. As you can see, now it has returned 201 created. And when we run this, so we're going to do the same put, but now with different data. We have a new given name added. If you do that, we see that it has the updated Louise here. But the return value is 200 OK, and that's because it replaced the previous version of Aretha with the new version of Aretha. And if you looked carefully, then you can also see that this version number is different than the version number before. So there's also a possibility to partially update a resource. I'm not going to go in depth into this because I think that a lot of FHIR servers do not really support patch yet. Bonk is working on it, and I think some other servers already support it. But there's a problem with patch because if you use a patch, then you update only selected elements of the resource. So you could, for example, just update the name of Aretha and leave the other elements of Aretha as they are. you can do that, but when you do that, you have a sort of yeah, because you only update a part of the resource, you kind of have a problem with concurrency, because other people can also update the resource partly or completely, and then the result is not always what you expect. So if I could give you an advice, I would say use put instead of batch. But if you really want to, you can of course do that. I'm not going to explain it to you. The thing is that it's low in bandwidth. Of course, you use less bytes. I don't think it's super huge thing at the moment anymore, but it's it could be interesting for mobile applications, for example, or because you have only partial access to the resource. For example, if you can only see certain fields of the resource, if you can only see certain fields, then you can also only update certain fields. That's the idea behind it. Okay, so the next action is the delete action. If you want to delete a resource, you use the HTTP delete. If the resource does not exist, delete will still return success. That's very nice. You don't have to worry about that. What you do have to worry about is that previous versions of a resource, as you saw before, there are versions of a resource. The previous versions of the resource still exist. So you have to, I mean, it's not a bad thing per se, but you have to think about that. If you think about regulation like HIPAA or GDPR, think about it. It's still there. So now just a little example of delete. It's gonna fire this request. Okay, you see that the server didn't even care to return content. Actually, it says no content. So I've deleted it. Patient 1 is not there anymore, and I see no content there. Actually, I'm going to reinstate the patient because I'm going to use it later. Okay, it's there again. I've brought it back to life. Okay, and there's also another possibility, and that's a batch. So you could bundle a few transactions or a few actions into a bundle, and you can post a bundle to the server root. And if you do that, a bundle is a FHIR resource, and it's like a list, so it contains items. And a bundle would normally contain a collection of requests. So every of the things that I've done before that you've seen me doing could also be in a collection of requests. And the requests are processed in order. So if you put them in a collection, the first request goes first, and then the second, and so on. And that's very important to know because, for example, if you create a patient and you want to create an observation for that patient, you want the create of the patient to go first, because otherwise the patient's not there when you create the observation. So there's two ways in which a batch can be processed. The normal way is called a batch. It's processed non-atomically, so it will just fire all the requests in order, but there will be there will be no transaction. So you won't be completely certain that all of the requests will go ahead. And if one does not, then the others will still go ahead. So the way to avoid this is to make it a transaction, of course, and then it's normally processed atomically. Some servers do sort of a, they say that they process it atomically, but they really don't. So you have to take care about that.
Abel, I have a question
Yes.
that is interesting for you. It says,
yeah, go ahead.
Patient, did anything happen to the observation reference?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
You deleted the patient.
Yeah.
Did anything happen to the observation reference?
No, it did not, because resources in FHIR are on itself, so they exist on itself. They have a reference to the patient, but the referential integrity is not maintained. At least not in some servers. It depends a little bit on the server. Some servers have made efforts to keep this this connection alive and to also to maintain it. But a lot of servers don't. So a lot of servers just see a resource as it is and not not connected to another resource. What you could do if you want to make sure that they both get deleted is put them inside a transaction. So if you want to delete the patient and also delete the observation, put them inside one transaction and you're sure that it's going to happen atomically. I'm just going to continue. Yeah, of course, the bundle. I'm just going to show you what a transaction looks like. So I have a transaction here. It's a bundle and it has a type of transaction. And as you can see, I've put some things together here. So I've got a patient, which is Fats Domino actually. And it has one observation, and the observation is created with a reference to the patient. And you see this very weird looking reference here. And it's actually an internal reference inside the bundle. So URN UID 61E, you can find that here. It's the full URL of the patient that I create as well. So the observation references the patient that was just created. And that's necessary because the patient does not have an ID yet, because it's created using a post. As you can see here in the request part of the transaction. So it will get assigned an ID and you don't know it yet before you have posted it. So that's the problem of the chicken and the egg, of course. So I'm just going to fire this against the server. And you see that it responds with a transaction response, which is also a bundle. And it gives me the patient, of course, if it's a domino. And the most interesting part, of course, is in the observation, because the observation now references the patient that I just created. 3ED0 is the ID. As you can see here, it's 3ED0. So it has made the connection because of the full URL that I just added. So normally when you post resources or when you put resources, the resource is going to be validated by the server. It depends, there are some levels of validation actually. So normally when you post, for example, JSON, the server will validate the JSON first, which is the serialization format. Then it will validate the FHIR basics. If you know anything about FHIR yet, you know that every resource has certain standard fields inside it. For example, the meta field. So you really need to validate that too. Then we have the FHIR type, for example, patient. A FHIR type contains certain fields, so patient contains some fields too, and it will check for those fields. If there's a field that should not be in patient, it will say something about it. And then the last level of validation is the profile. We're not going to talk about profiles here, but the profile is something that you put on a patient as a restriction to the patient. The restrictions are also checked. And some servers, as I put it here, it's also check on referential integrity, but not all do. So I'm just going to do this very quickly. Putting in an observation. As you can see, it returns with a bad request. And I'm just going to check why, because it returned me an operation outcome, which is the FHIR way of saying something is wrong. I'm gonna list the details about it. So it lists the details, and it says here, instance count for observation status is 0, which is not within the specified cardinality if 1.1. So I should have included a status actually in this resource. Stupid me. status is, actually I don't know what the status should be, but I'll see, because I'm just going to type something here. It will give me a different error. Will give me a different error, but not the error that I was getting right now. Ah, look, so hi is does not exist in the code system, because it should be inside the value set observation status, as you see here. Okay, I'm not gonna go further on this road. I'm just gonna continue. So the same thing that you can do with posting something, you can also do with a so-called validate operation. A validate operation is one of the operations that FHIR defines. There are many of those operations. You can look them up actually in the documentation. One of them is validate, and the big advantage of validate is that it validates before you post something. So you can just validate it without any problem. Just show you what happens. It says 200 OK for the same resource. And 200 OK means, yeah, I validated it for you, but it's still not OK. Look here. So I've still got the same operation outcome here with the instance count error. So as you saw with all the requests that I did until now, you saw that yeah, there are some very interesting fields like location, content type, which is the serialization format that you get back. That's something you can ask for. You can say, I want only this content type. And you get an e-tag, which is for concurrency. I'll talk about that later. Now, there's also a possibility to tweak a little bit what you get back. We've seen the operation outcome come back, as we saw before. And we've also saw a minimal result, which is actually an empty result. You can get that for a delete, for example. But there's a way to ask the server for a specific result using the prefer header. Okay, so that about the serialization format, you've got, of course, you can use JSON or XML or Turtle. It's all in the FHIR spec. Vonk only has JSON and XML actually. And if you use that content type, then you can also add a FHIR version to it. And sometimes it's necessary, sometimes it's not, because some servers only use a single FHIR, only have a single FHIR version, but Vonk has two, for example. So sometimes, if you don't use a specific R4 endpoint, for example, you need to add a FHIR version to your format to make the server, to let the server know in what format you're posting actually. So if you want to ask for a certain format from the server, you can do that in the accept header. You can accept a certain content type, like application/FHIR plus JSON. So it will return you JSON. And if you ask for application/FHIR plus XML, then you get XML back. And you get it back in the content type header of the response. If you use the content type, if you use the accept header, then there's some content negotiation going on. So you could have different formats. So you can ask for either JSON or XML, and the server will decide based on its capabilities what it's going to return. So we're just going to try this. I have an accept header here. It says that I want XML, but the content type that I'm going to send is FHIR JSON with version 3.0. As you can see, I'm going to post it. I'm going to put it to an R4 endpoint. So let's see what happens. Okay, I get back XML. That's good. But it's of course an operation outcome, because the information models specified an endpoint, FHIR version 4, in the accept header, and the content type header must be consistent. So it says here that, okay, I've tried to post a FHIR 3 resource to a FHIR 4 server. I will change it now just to see if it works, because actually the resource that I'm going to send doesn't it's both for R3 and R4. It will work. It won't actually. Because the status is also not there. Okay, I don't know about the status, so I'm going to continue. Okay, one of the important things about a FHIR server is its capability statement. The capability statement tells you what a FHIR can do and what it cannot do, because FHIR servers, they implement the spec, but actually none of them implement the complete spec. So there's always going to be some parts of the spec that it does not implement. And so if you look at the capability statement, which gives you an idea of what the server can do, it allows you to compare servers. So if you need certain functionality, you can compare the servers based on the capability statement. You could automatically hide functionality in the UI, for example, if you know that if you're creating a web app, for example, and you don't know which server is behind it, you can hide functionality based on the capability statement. And you can also progressively use better or faster methods if you want to. So a capability statement gives you information on a per server and a per resource and a per operation basis. That's the 3 levels of capability that a FHIR server can have. I'm just kind of, I'm looking at my time, so I have to make a little bit of speed. So I'm just going to look at the capability statement. This is the one that comes from Wonk. Well, this is all the uninteresting data. But what you can see, for example, is this is the REST part that contains all the REST service. And you can see here that, for example, it implements the formats XML and JSON. It's for FHIR version 4. And we'll look at the REST part as well. So for example, it names here the resources. You have an account resource here, for example, and the interactions that it supports for that are create, delete, history instance, and so on and so on. So those are the interactions that it will support on account. And for every resource, this is mentioned actually. What you see here, for example, is the conditional create. And this is also interesting. So if you search, you can create the account owner, for example. This is all very interesting. You have to read about it. You have to just look for a capability statement. You can actually ask for one from a Wonk server, or you can look for the Happy server, for example. Just ask for the metadata. I hope it's responding because it's probably busy because of DevDays. It's not. Okay. Okay, no problem. Just go on. Okay, so this is the part about storing resources, but there's also, of course, the fetching of resources. You want to fetch a resource. Well, the most basic way to fetch a resource is to fetch it by ID, and it's just like this: get patient /1 or patient ID is 1. That gives the same result actually. I'll show you what that looks like.
That's 5 minutes.
Yeah. So let's see what went wrong here. Okay, I've got the wrong server. Okay, so I've patient 1, which is Aretha Franklin. I've asked it in XML. Well, you see it. I've asked it by ID. Now I'm just going to change this a little bit. I'm going to ask it by ID is 1. You see that it's the same resource because Miss Aretha Franklin is still here. She's still in the result set, but it's a bundle now. And the reason why is that I've done a search actually now. I didn't ask for just one resource. I've done a search by using ID is 1. So one of the things that I told you before about is versions. So I've got the resource has a certain amount of versions, and you can ask for the versions when when you ask for the history of the resource type. I'm just going to skip it a little bit because I'm out of time. So this is patient 1. This is Aretha Franklin, and I've asked for the history, and I get a bundle back which says type history. As you can see, I've done a few actions on this resource already. I've got a put, I've got a delete, I've got a put again. And as you can see, every of those actions has a version ID. So these are the versions of the single resource patient/1. So you can do a search using the search parameters. As you can see here, I'm searching for myself because my name is Enthoven and my birth date is 1975/12/21. You can also use a forum post, and that's actually a little bit safer, because when you use a forum post in the same way, then you are sending the data in your body and not in your header. And headers are protected by HTTPS and stuff like that, but they get logged a lot. So they will be in the log somewhere, and you don't want that. Because, you know, as you can see, you can look me up in the Netherlands if you want to. Okay, so search parameters, you have a lot of different parameters. Some of them are in the FHIR standard. They're defined in the FHIR standard. And also you can use custom search parameters. So they're defined in the FHIR standard for every resource type, and you can also define them yourself. As you can see here on the bottom, you can see the number, date, string. Those are the types of the parameters, and those have different ways of writing the values. So these are, you're going to have this PowerPoint, so you can look it up yourself. Just going to do the search with that form encoded, and I get a bundle back. Interesting thing about it is that's a search set, so you always get a search set back. Let me see if there's any. Yeah, there's also an interesting thing here, down here. When you have a bundle, you always have links inside your bundle. In this case, there's only a link to the bundle itself, but you could also have links to, for example, the next bundle, because a server will usually return only like the first 10 results and then give you a link to the next set of results. So search parameters have modifiers as well. As you can see here, there are quite a lot.
1 minute.
Yeah, I've got only 1 minute, so I'm sort of running out of time here. Yeah, so these are the modifiers. You can also look them up later. And also you have prefixes, and it means that you can play a little bit around with dates and times and do a greater than or an equal or whatever. And you could also do chaining with search parameters. So you could say, you could not say patient is this, but you could say, I have an observation and the patient.family is Enthoven. And it means that you're going to look for observations with a patient that has family name Enthoven. And the same way you can also include, for example, the patient of an observation using the include parameter.
And Abel, I do apologize. We are out of time.
Yeah, I know. It's okay.
All right. And thank you very much. And thank you all for attending. Please do note that the Q&A on Whova is going to be persistent. So if you have asked a question that hasn't been answered, moderator and the speaker today will be monitoring that, and we'll make sure you get that answered. Thank you very much.
Yeah, if people want to know more, they can also hit me up.
Okay,
I think
fantastic.
I answered everything.
Sorry?
I think I answered everything.
Oh, you answered everything. Oh, that's great.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
And don't forget to check the agenda on Whova to get to your next meeting. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right.